The desert sun baked down on the forward operating base, and the air hummed with the faint static of radios and generators. Elena Carter wiped the sweat from her brow as she hunched over a half-disassembled comms panel. She was only 24, fresh-faced compared to the hardened Marines and Navy SEALs who roamed the base. But her hands were steady, her mind sharp, and her skill with military communications had earned her a spot at the heart of a war zone. To the men on the front lines, she was just the comms girl. To her, she was a lifeline, though no one ever seemed to notice. Quick pause. Comment where you're watching from. And if you love these stories, hit subscribe now. The next one will blow your mind, and it's even crazier. Word of an operation filtered through the dusty air, Operation Spearpoint. It was bold, high risk, and led by Navy SEAL Lieutenant Michael Hayes, a soldier whispered about with reverence, the way some spoke about Marcus Luttrell or Chris Kyle. Elena overheard fragments of chatter: hostage recovery, heavy enemy presence, hostile terrain. She wasn't part of the mission, not really. Her orders were to stay at the base and keep the lines clear. But war doesn't ask permission before rewriting your role. Moments after the SEALs deployed, chaos erupted. Mortar fire rained down nearby, rattling the base, and the comms boards in front of Elena went dark. Enemy forces had cut power to the relay station in the hills, severing all contact with Hayes' team. Voices around her rose in panic. Without communications, the SEALs were blind, cut off, walking into a trap. Officers barked orders, but no one volunteered to repair the relay. It was outside the wire in enemy territory, crawling with insurgents. Elena's chest tightened. She wasn't trained for combat. Her weapon was a soldering iron, not an M4. But she thought of the SEALs out there, of Hayes and his men counting on someone unseen, someone who wasn't supposed to be a warrior. She strapped on her vest, grabbed her toolkit and rifle, and before anyone could stop her, she was gone. The hills burned with gunfire as Elena crawled through sand and dust, every breath filling her lungs with grit. Bullets snapped overhead, kicking up dirt around her, but she pressed forward. The relay station loomed ahead, smoke curling from its shredded antenna. Enemy fighters patrolled nearby, their shadows cast long by the fading sun. She waited, heart pounding, then sprinted low, sliding behind a concrete barrier. Her hands trembled as she pried open the metal housing, exposing shredded wires and fried circuits. She dug into her pack, pulling tools with a speed that came only from instinct. Sparks hissed as she twisted copper to copper, her fingers blistering. The crack of rifles drew closer. Elena glanced up. 2 insurgents were cresting the ridge. She dropped her pliers, yanked her M4 into position, and fired. The recoil shook her to her core, but both men dropped. Her ears rang. She returned to the wires, one hand still clutching the rifle, the other fumbling with connectors. Her breath came ragged, her vision blurred, but she didn't stop. A rocket-propelled grenade slammed into the dirt nearby, throwing her against the relay. Blood trickled from a cut above her brow. She forced herself upright, teeth gritted. The relay flickered once, then again. She jammed the final connection into place and hit the switch. The lights blinked green. Static surged, then cleared. Far off, Hayes' voice crackled through the radio. "This is SEAL Team Alpha. We're under heavy fire. Request immediate support." His tone was calm, but Elena could hear the strain. Her chest flooded with relief. She grabbed the handset, her voice shaking as she relayed the coordinates. Air support was already circling. They just needed a signal. Moments later, the sky roared with the thunder of jets, and the valley lit up with precision strikes. Hayes' men were saved, and all because the comms were back online. Elena slumped against the relay, her rifle still across her lap, adrenaline draining from her veins. The world felt heavy, muffled, unreal. She barely noticed the soldiers rushing toward her until strong hands pulled her up and guided her back to base. When she returned, the entire camp was silent. SEAL Team Alpha had made it back, battered but alive. Lieutenant Hayes, bruised and bloodied, walked through the crowd straight to Elena. Dust streaked his face, but his eyes were sharp, unwavering. In front of Marines, SEALs, and officers, he stopped, squared his shoulders, and raised his hand in a crisp salute. The air seemed to freeze. Officers did not salute technicians. It wasn't protocol. It wasn't tradition. But Hayes broke both without hesitation. "For courage under fire," he said simply, his voice carrying in the stillness. You saved us all. Elena's throat tightened. She wanted to shrink away, to vanish back into the shadows of wires and circuits, but Hayes's salute held her in place. Around them, soldiers began to murmur, then fall silent again, realizing they had witnessed something rare, an officer honoring the unseen hand that carried the mission. She lowered her gaze, a tear tracing the grime on her cheek, and managed a shaky nod. Hayes dropped his salute, gave her a look that would burn in her memory forever, and turned back to his men. That night, as the base buzzed with stories of the mission, Elena sat quietly by her bench, soldering iron in hand, pretending nothing had changed. But every soldier who passed her gave her a glance they hadn't before, not of dismissal, but of respect. In the war, she hadn't fired the most bullets or charged the enemy line, but she had held the lifeline steady when it mattered most, and for that, even a Navy SEAL lieutenant had saluted her. Some stories of courage are written in blood, others in silence. Elena Carter's was written in wires, sparks, and the unshakable will of a young woman who refused to let heroes fall without a fight. Charlotte, Charlie Dawson, never wanted recognition. She was a British comms engineer, deployed alongside NATO forces in Syria, where the desert wind carried dust and the echo of distant gunfire. To most soldiers, she was invisible, just the girl with the headset and the toolkit, always hunched over antennas and cables. She was not SAS, not a Marine, not a Navy SEAL. But she knew something the warriors didn't always admit. Battles were won or lost in the silence between transmissions. Her job was to make sure that silence never came. The day began like countless others, but a mission soon unfolded that would push Charlie far beyond her role. American and British forces were working together to strike deep into hostile territory, where insurgents were holding several civilians captive. The tip of the spear was a SEAL team led by Lieutenant Brandon Cole, a man soldiers compared in hushed tones to legends like Mike Murphy and Audie Murphy. The operation depended on encrypted towers and long-range radios that only Charlie and her team could keep alive. Without them, the SEALs were blind and deaf in enemy land. Midway through the mission, as the SEALs closed in, the unthinkable happened. Explosions rattled the forward base, and suddenly every screen and handset in Charlie's control center went black. The radio towers, critical for the mission, had been sabotaged. Soldiers cursed, commanders slammed fists against tables. The SEAL team had vanished into silence. Charlie's pulse raced. Without communications, Lieutenant Cole and his men had no support, no extraction, and no chance to coordinate with air cover. Hours of planning evaporated in seconds. Officers debated sending reinforcements, but every minute wasted put the hostages and the SEALs closer to death. Charlie knew what had to be done, but the thought twisted her stomach. The towers were 5 kilometers out, in hostile ground where ambushes waited like wolves in the dark. She wasn't a fighter. She wasn't supposed to carry a rifle, yet no one else could repair the encrypted system. If she didn't go, the mission was doomed. She strapped on her vest, tucked her toolkit beside a standard-issue SA-80 rifle, and joined a convoy of Marines heading toward the tower. The ride was tense, every shadow a threat, every bend in the road a trap. Then the ambush came. Gunfire erupted from the ridges, bullets hammering the vehicles, dust and smoke swallowing the convoy. Charlie dove for cover, heart pounding, ears ringing. A Marine shoved her down, shouting for her to stay low, but instinct forced her to act. She raised the rifle, the weight foreign in her hands, and fired toward the muzzle flashes. The crack of return fire filled her chest with both terror and defiance. When the firefight eased, the convoy pushed forward, battered but alive. They reached the tower, a mangled skeleton of metal scarred by explosives. Shrapnel littered the ground. Charlie sprinted to the base, knees hitting dirt as she pried open the ruined panels. Wires were shredded, circuits scorched. She bit her lip hard enough to taste blood and pulled out her tools. Around her, Marines formed a defensive ring, trading fire with insurgents closing in. Her hands shook, but she forced them steady, twisting copper, bridging circuits, stripping insulation with her teeth when her knife slipped. An explosion shook the tower, spraying her with dirt. A shard cut across her arm, warm blood dripping down, but she refused to stop. She pressed wires together, sparks spitting into her face, and prayed the system would take. Almost there, she shouted, her voice hoarse. She didn't know if anyone heard her. Through the static of her headset, a voice cracked alive. "This is SEAL Team Bravo. We need extraction now." It was Lieutenant Cole, his words tight with strain. Relief surged through Charlie, nearly buckling her knees. She screamed into the mic, relaying coordinates, guiding air support in. Minutes later, the sky trembled. The roar of Allied aircraft drowned the battlefield, precision strikes lighting up the horizon. The insurgents scattered under the bombardment, and the SEAL team carried the hostages to safety. The mission, against all odds, had succeeded. When Charlie staggered back to base, clothes torn, blood crusted on her sleeve, she expected to fade again into anonymity. She imagined slipping back to her bench, a nameless tech girl behind the curtain. But fate had other plans. The SEALs had returned, battered yet victorious, and Lieutenant Cole walked straight through the crowd toward her. Every soldier stopped speaking. Dust clung to his uniform, but his gaze was sharp, unwavering. In front of SAS operators, U.S. Marines, and British officers, he stopped before Charlie and raised his hand in a crisp salute. The silence that followed was heavier than any explosion. A Navy SEAL officer saluting a COAMS engineer. It wasn't custom, it wasn't regulation, but it was respect. Raw and undeniable. "For holding the line when no one else could," Cole said, his voice steady, carrying across the gathered troops. Charlie's throat tightened. Her eyes burned, though she tried to blink it away. She lowered her head slightly, overwhelmed, her fingers still trembling from the fight. Around her, soldiers who once dismissed her as just the girl with the toolkit now looked at her with something entirely different: reverence. That night, as the base hummed with whispered retellings of the mission, Charlie sat at her bench again, repairing a headset, pretending nothing had changed. Yet deep down she knew it had. Her courage was no longer invisible. She had carried the mission when it mattered most, and the salute of a Navy SEAL lieutenant had etched her name into the unspoken stories of war. Some heroes carry rifles into the breach. Others carry wires, circuits, and an unshakable will. Charlie Dawson carried both, and proved that courage isn't about rank, but about refusing to let silence win.